Hello, welcome to Insights, Newcastle University's Public Lectures programme. I'm Martin Farr, co-chair of the programme. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's online lecture to be given by Dr. Mike Martin, entitled Why Do We Fight? Evolutionary Neuroscience Meets Conflict Studies. I'll reappear at the end of the lecture in about half an hour's time to field questions and answers and comments with our speaker. So if you have anything you'd like to ask him or anything you'd like to raise, please add something into the chat box on YouTube on your screen now, or you can tweet it. Our handle is @InsightsNCL, and you can add the hashtag @InsightsNCL in your message and question. This evening's speaker is a former British Army officer who pioneered, designed, and implemented the Army's Cultural Advisor Programme, about which I'll be speaking to him later. He worked as an advisor to 4 commanders of the UK's task force, Helmand, advising them on local national population dynamics. He subsequently took his PhD at King's College London. His first degree was in biology at Oxford, as will be very clear in the talk. He wrote an oral history of the conflict in Helmand province from 1978 to 2012, which was later turned into a book, An Intimate War. His latest book is called Why We Fight, which has been so widely reviewed, it's just been translated into Estonian. And so I'll hand over to our speaker for this evening, Dr. Mike Martin.
Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to tackle a central paradox of war, and that is that war is an anti-evolutionary activity. So, as you know, evolution is about survival and reproduction. But war, which is a central human activity and has been throughout our history, pervasive across every society, is an activity that has a huge death rate. And so, to put that in figures, the French lost in World War I about 30% of the men aged between 18 and 30, and that's the prime reproductive cohort. So in biological terms, we call this a negative selection pressure. But it's more than that as well. War is also exhilarating and pleasurable and fun. And of course, there are negative emotions that go with war, and often it's a knife edge between the two. But there's no denying that there is a drive towards war, particularly among young men. And when they get there and they fight it, often it is pleasurable to them. And I say that speaking as someone who has had brief experiences of combat in Afghanistan, but who's also spent a lot of time talking to soldiers and working with soldiers and studying war. And again, going back to the biology, if something's pleasurable, then we've evolved to pursue that activity. So having sex, eating food, these things are pleasurable. And that's for very good reason, because they enhance our ability to survive and reproduce. They work out for us in evolutionary mathematics. So what is it that means that we have evolved these desires to go to war? What are those desires? And what are the advantages they have for us? So we've got to situate humans in the animal kingdom, okay? And we've all evolved. We're all part of the animal kingdom, just like snails or snakes or primates. And we've all looked at the David Attenborough nature videos. Individuals in different animal species compete with each other for resources, and they can be real resources like food or water or mating partners, or they can be surrogate resources like territory or status. And a surrogate resource is something that if you hold it, it enables you to get hold of a real resource. And this is true of humans as well, of course. And I want to focus on something in particular that humans compete for, and that's status. Now, there's a difference between the sexes in terms of pursuit of status, and this probably won't surprise you, but men pursue it more than women, and they're hormonally driven to pursue it more than women. There's a particular hormone called testosterone, which I'm sure you've heard of. Men have 20 times the levels of it that women do. And testosterone doesn't cause aggression. That's a bit of a misnomer. Actually, testosterone causes you to seek status. And sometimes when you get into status clashes with other people, aggression is a way of resolving those status clashes. That's where we get slightly confused about what testosterone is for. But actually, it's about pursuing status. It drives humans to pursue status, and it drives, on average, men are driven more than women to pursue status because of this hormone. And why is that? Well, there's actually an imbalance between men and women when it comes to reproduction. And although we have equal numbers of men and women on the planet, actually in the reproductive ages, again, sort of 18 to 32, there's an imbalance between the sexes. And that's because women are taken out of the reproductive game for much longer than men. It's about 2 years to have a child and then breastfeed it and then move on to your next child. And for men, the contribution is, anything between 10 seconds and a minute. And so in that particular reproductive cohort, it's the supply and demand. There's many more men available for reproduction than there are women, and therefore men compete with each other for access to those remaining women in the mating pool. And so this is why men are 15%, on average, 15% stronger than women, and they're taller, and they seek status more because they're competing with each other for the women. And rather than competing directly, although that does occur, but actually what they do is they compete for status. So men compete with other men for status, where they are in the pecking order, and then those men higher up the pecking order get access to more mating partners. And actually, for most of our evolutionary history, humans have been polygamous. And so the higher up you go up the hierarchy, the status hierarchy, the more women you get hold of. And we see this competition reflected in criminology, in murder statistics. So 95% of murders are committed by men, and men are also in most of the armies. Until very recently, men comprised most of the armies in the world. And of that 95%, 2/3 of those are in that age of the reproductive cohort, 18 to 30 or so, 18 to 32. And the vast majority of those are about status disputes, what criminologists call trivial altercations. And these are, you're in a pub and there's a fight over the pool table, or perhaps someone's, you've looked at my bird, like, what and there's a lot of that goes on and actually drives, because most murders are not premeditated. Most are just bursts of anger. And this is true right back in time as well. If you look at England has murder records stretching back to Norman times, because justice, the resolution of murder and rape cases was one of the first services that the Norman kings provided to the Anglo-Saxon population. So we have these records from 1215 or whatever of murders, and they were the same. It was arguments in an inn over a game of chess or over someone's mistress. Very same pattern as we see now. And interestingly, those murders are actually also concentrated in, I guess, what you might call the lower socioeconomic classes, because people at the lower end of the status ladder, in a species that's until recently was, in biologically were considered mostly polygamous, but that actually in human societies were polygamous, and many still are. And what polygamy means is if the top 50% of men in status terms have 2 wives, the bottom 50% have no wives, and so they have no chance of reproducing. So if you're in the bottom of the status pile, you need to get to the top. And so if someone's challenging you, your status or your face effectively, then you need to respond, and violence is often the way you respond to climb up the ladder, because if you hold status, you're much more likely to be able to get a mating partner and then reproduce. And so this evolution has left us with these rules of thumb, which are broadly, if you're a young male, compete with other young males for status, particularly at that time, because the position that you achieve in society at that time translates into reproductive and evolutionary success over your life. And I guess where does that relate to war? Because that's individual violence, right? Well, it actually relates through leaders. And if you think about leaders, they are people who fight for status more, and also are more successful at gaining status, right? And so often they have high levels of testosterone, and usually coupled with intelligence as well. And those guys rise up to the top of their groups. And when they get to the tops of their groups, be it a tribe or a gang or a nation state or whatever, they've won that status pursuit in their group, and therefore they look at other groups and see other leaders of other groups, and they are the people that they then seek to have status disputes with. And we see this amongst world leaders now. We just look around and look at Trump and Putin and tell me that these people are not driven by slight and insult and personal status. So I guess I'll conclude by saying, Hobbes was right. This war of all against all that he sort of spoke about in his work is true. The natural state of man, I think, is one where individual men compete and there is violence. But of course, we don't live like that. We've escaped this Hobbesian world by building groups, right? And groups are by definition non-violent. And what they do is the groups, social groups, and nation states, but think of tribes or chieftainships or ancient empires, going back through macro history. These groups provide us with security, of course, because they're non-violent. They provide us with sex, mating partners. Anyone who's moved from, a village to a city will know that the bigger group has a greater opportunity for mating. And resources, more efficient use of resources, right? Groups are better at using resources and they have higher levels of technology. And so for all these things, sex, resources, and security, we have evolved this other drive, which is to belong to social groups. And again, a bit like testosterone, there's also a hormone that drives that, which is oxytocin. And this is the hormone that you probably would have heard of, involved in, lactation and childbirth. But evolution repurposed it, and that is the hormone that causes us to seek to belong to in-groups. Now, of course, why can't we just have a world where everyone belongs to one in-group? Well, the reason for that is because if you think about it, if you evolve in a population, this desire to effectively trust everyone else and be in a group with them, very quickly another genotype would evolve that said, take advantage of all those people who are trusting and nice. And so what you have to do is, at the same time as evolving this mechanism to belong to an in-group, you have to also put a line between in-groups and out-groups. So you can't have an in-group without an out-group. And we know it's the same mechanism because in lots and lots and lots of experiments, as people feel stronger attachments to in-groups, they feel more negative feelings or more derogatory, or they trust less out-groups. And, we see this as well if we look around our society and look at patriotism, nationalism, racism. These are all sort of in-group, out-group dynamics. And they're two sides, really, of the same coin, which is human group attachment. Now, the key thing here is that war really is the price that we pay for membership to an in-group, right? And what I mean by that is think back to the kind of environment that Homo sapiens did most of their evolution in. This was on the African savannah. In that environment, being a member of a group was vital for all those sex, resources, and security that we've spoken about. And to get cast out or ostracized from that group was effectively a death sentence. And as with all animal groups or human groups, there's a price of membership, and that price of membership is effectively going to war. And the death rate from going to war, even if it's crazy high, like 30%, is still lower than the death rate from being ostracized, and probably lower than the death rate from that violence, that interpersonal violence, that war of all against all. So war is a kind of byproduct of that mechanism. So how do these things come together? So we've got status and we've got belonging. And humans fight for both of them, and they're both subconscious urges modulated by hormones and also by receptors in your brain. So you produce hormones, testosterone is produced in the gonads, for instance, and it affects all sorts of parts of your body. We're sort of aware of why men look different to women. And one of the reasons for that is because of testosterone, but it also affects your brain. You have testosterone and oxytocin receptors in your brain, and so they affect your behavior as well. And oxytocin also affects, by the way, men and women differently. And with women, it causes them to feel more pleasurable about in-groups, but no more negative about out-groups if you give them testosterone, a little spray up their nose. And with men, actually, interestingly, you give them testosterone, it causes them to feel negative feelings about out-groups more than it does positive feelings about in-groups. And you can sort of tell a Just So story about why that might be in evolution, with the subdivision of labor between men and women, one more focused on looking after the offspring and the other more focused on dealing with outside threats to that family unit. And, as we've already said, these things interact. Winning feels good. Winning a status dispute feels good. And belonging to a group feels good. Perhaps you have sung in a choir, or maybe when you hear the national anthem, or your sports team, you're in a football crowd and your team's song is being shouted in the stadium. These things feel good. And when they feel really good, that little shiver you get down the spine from group activities, that's the oxytocin pathway triggering other pleasure hormones and giving you a real good dose of feeling good. For me, I get that very strong emotional response of group feeling when I hear the last post. Serving in Afghanistan, I heard that, unfortunately, a couple of times a week, 3 times a week, when we had last post ceremonies, when people have been killed. And anytime I hear that now, it takes me straight back to that experience and very strong feelings of group belonging. So the key thing about these two urges is actually that they interact, though. And they interact via the relationship between leaders and followers. So if you think about a group in kind of abstract terms, you have a leader, and you have a bunch of followers. And what the followers are mostly looking for is a sense of belonging, and the leaders emotionally help provide that for them. They might define the group. They might say, we are British, or we are Manchester United supporters, or we are, the Bath Choral Society, or whatever it is. And they might set some rules, or they might set a framework, or perhaps but they create emotionally the identity, or they help reinforce the identity of that group. They provide a focal point for that group. And so leaders help provide the sense of belonging to followers. And then the inverse happens with status, right? So followers, because they follow a leader, there's no such thing as a leader without followers. But because the leader has followers, he feels that sense of status. He's won in that group and become the leader of that group. And so he has a sense of status from those followers. And there's this balance really between the two. And you get leaders having status disputes with other leaders at the same time as they're reinforcing group belonging. And then the followers feel that group sense of belonging, but that's also twinged with an out-group, negative sense towards out-groups. So you get the oxytocin ratchet, where you get counter-reaction between in-group tightening and out-group tightening. And then the leaders are having status disputes with other leaders. And those two hormonal pathways work together on an emotional sense to drive human groups towards war. So that really is the subconscious emotional reason that we fight. But there is something else going on, which is going on in our conscious brain, because actually a lot of the time we're not even really aware of that stuff. So I'll just quickly go through the difference between the conscious and the unconscious brains. Many of you might have read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, but it has this idea in it that the conscious brain is slower and takes longer to reach decisions than the unconscious brain. And the unconscious brain works off evolutionary rules of thumb and makes decisions quite quickly. And your conscious brain comes along later and effectively provides justification for those already made unconscious decisions. Perhaps we've actually already we're aware of that in ourselves. Sometimes when people ask us a question, we start answering the question without knowing how we're going to answer, and then the words come out, and then we think, yes, that was a good reason for why I thought that. Which is why many people have to think while speaking. I'm certainly one of those people. And that idea has been developed a little bit, this idea of the conscious brain coming along and rationalizing the decisions that we've already made unconsciously. And actually, scientists now think that, because the question is, why did the conscious brain evolve? Because it's energy intensive, it's slower, but actually one of the big advantages of a conscious brain is it helps us model ourselves in relation to the groups that we live in. So self versus other, other versus self, other versus other. So we can see our position within a group. And that's obviously a huge evolutionary advantage, particularly in social species like ourselves. Stops you getting ostracized, stops you making faux pas that get you kicked out, for one. And the way we do that, the way our conscious brains do that, is they sort of translate our desires, our subconscious desires, in this case towards status and belonging, and they enable us to speak those desires to others in socially acceptable ways. And we try and convince others for our own reasons, and we actually end up convincing ourselves as well. So you never hear a leader say, I want to be powerful. You might do, but they probably won't end up a leader. But you do hear them saying, I want to improve the condition of the people in my group, or, I want to make society better, and so on and so forth. So that's effectively what's going on with war. What we're doing is we are coming up with socially acceptable reasons for these urges. And we're not being cynical. We're actually not aware of those urges really in ourselves. And so we tend to think that war is about morals, religions, and ideologies. And the reasons we think it's about those things is because those are the socially normative, acceptable things that we can speak about that enable us to sort of channel our urges into a framework that other people can understand. So we say that, war is about right or wrong, or it's about this God or that God, or it's about this set of ideas or that set of ideas. And that enables us to speak a common language with everyone else that everyone understands. And you can actually, if you look through the speeches of leaders going to war, or soldiers, or letters of soldiers, you see these concepts reflected. So really what we're doing is justifying ourselves, these drives towards status and belonging, to others and also to ourselves. And we often end up convincing ourselves that we're fighting for democracy or communism or jihadism or this particular God or that particular God, or it's about right and wrong. And really, whether it's about morals, religions, ideology, it actually depends on the type of society that we live in. If we lived in a tribal society, it would be about our tribal code, our tribal group. Perhaps if we organize our society was mostly organized around religion, we tend to find that our wars are about religion. And in the West, we tend to find our wars are about ideologies, because we've built a highly ideological society. We think we're sort of ideological, but actually we're the most ideological society probably that's ever existed in terms of the number of ideas and the battle of ideas going on. So I will leave you with a final thought, which is that these frameworks that we often say cause war, good and bad, and religion causes war and ideology causes war and violence, actually those frameworks reduce violence in the long term. If you think about macro-human history, it's really a story of ever greater group size. So we've gone from tribal bands to tribal confederations to chieftainships to, settling in villages to going up to ancient empires and nation states, and now where we are now, sort of quasi-global thing. And at the same time, remember, groups are kind of non-violent. As we've lived in bigger and bigger groups, relatively speaking, in relative terms, we as humans experience less and less violence. So the current state of play in the world, although it doesn't feel like it, is it's actually the least violent time to be alive ever in the history of our species. So you've got the macro human history, right? Increasing group size, decrease in violence. And the reason we've been able to build those bigger groups that's helped us reduce levels of violence is morals, religions, and ideologies. These are just frameworks that enable us to coordinate bigger and bigger groups of humans, and coordinating bigger groups of humans makes cohesive groups, and cohesive groups are non-violent. And so these frameworks, ironically, and this is the final thought, that we think cause war, morals, religions, and ideologies, actually help us reduce violence in the long term. Thank you very much.
And we're here live with our speaker, Mike Martin. Welcome to Insights.
Hi, Martin. Good to be here, or wherever we are.
Your location is of interest, I think, because this is demonstrating the advantages of Zoom. This wouldn't be possible before Zoom. Please tell our viewers where you are and what you're doing.
I'm in Queensland, Australia, just north of Brisbane, and my wife and I are circumnavigating the globe by sailboat, temporarily waylaid while the borders are all closed, but hoping to pick up again in a couple of months.
Very much on the beach, so kind of a Neville Shute vibe. I can sort of sense there. You've gone to the last place where you can go, and they've closed off the borders. It's really, it's too much. That was an extremely interesting and insightful and wide-ranging lecture, which answers all sorts of questions that I'd always kind of thought or wondered about the subject. The one that came across as a person engaged in academia itself is how you researched it. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning you did biological sciences at Oxford and you're doing your PhD and so on, but how did you go about the research for that? Personal experience, archival, scientific work? How did you do it?
I think I was led by my personal experience, and largely that was one of dissonance. My experiences of fighting war were really different to what I seemed to read about war, and what I also saw, I don't know, what you might loosely call the commentariat, so newspaper columnists or perhaps even politicians, who haven't fought. The way they described war were completely different to how I experienced it and how others that fought with me experienced it. And I just pick one example, which is really easy. Largely when, again, just use this word, the commentariat, talk about war, they talk about ideas, and they often frame war as a clash of religions or ideologies, but what was very, very clear to me was that all of that stuff's fine, but actually in the moment, all of that goes out of the window, because the most important thing is survival. And war is a very primal, emotional thing. And it seems to me there must be some baser instincts that were driving people to war. Now, all of those good, higher level, if you term it that, instincts are great in the sense that they often hold people back from war. They give us reason and they enable us to solve problems. But there must be some baser instincts that drove us to fight, because it's so ubiquitous in the human species. And so from that start point, which was largely one of confusion and dissonance, and also my own experiences, coming out of Afghanistan, kind of trying to process all of that. I spent 2 years in Helmand, some of the anger and other emotions that I felt coming out of that war, which I think, common to a lot of veterans of that conflict. They drove me to seek answers, and the way I seek answers as an academic is through reasoned, academic study and reading innumerable numbers of books and journals and trying to piece together what it was, and why we fight as a result of that.
But to contest your point about dissonance, we have a question from Ed, who asks, how do you account for cooperation and peace? Isn't that the real story of human success compared to our more distrustful primate cousins?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I totally agree with Ed. A lot of people try to look for what is the unique thing about human species, and they say, well, it's tool use or whatever it is. Actually, I think the unique thing, as Ed hints at, is this ability to cooperate in large groups. And at a family level or a hunter-gatherer level, that's a kind of fairly simple emotional mechanism, that belonging, that sense of belonging that we spoke about. And then that mechanism is supplanted onto ever larger groups. And we use conscious frameworks to help us supplant those emotions onto ever larger groups. So, religions or belief in, legal systems or other ideologies like communism or capitalism, these enable us to build mega groups of humans. And absolutely, that is without a doubt the one very clear-cut distinguishing feature between humans and non-humans. But I think the other thing is that the brain has evolved piecemeal, is the best way to describe it. And some of that evolution was done in other species, when we weren't hominids. And some, so the fear response, for example, is very highly conserved within evolution for obvious reasons. And, we probably picked that up when we were reptiles. And some other bits, discussing philosophy perhaps, or building complex groups would be something that's the biological foundations for which have been laid much more recently. But because of that, you've still got all those mechanisms in your brain, right? So bits of your brain might pull you towards a knee-jerk fear response or a pursuit of status in order to get a mate. And other bits of your brain which have evolved for the same reasons to help you survive and reproduce, might pull you towards actually cooperation is the way to do it. And we see this is why human behavior, if we could distill it to a spreadsheet, then we wouldn't have any literature or any fiction. And it's because of that complexity of human behavior. How I behave is dependent on, of course, my genes, also the environment that I grew up in, the experiences I've had to date, and also what's right in front of me. So that makes human behavior undeniably complex, because all these different drives are pulling you in different directions. I think all I sought to do with Why We Fight was to try and answer the simple question that I posited at the beginning, which was, if we've got a phenomenon that is widespread amongst the human species, namely war, how can it be when on the face of it, it seems to be a very, very anti-evolutionary activity? But that's a great question, Ed.
This one follows up very nicely about your point about physiognomy. Susan asks, could the conscious brain have evolved from the animal response of accepting lower status by lying down, exposing bellies, etc.?
Wow. The best thing about these talks is that you get questions that you have never considered. That's a fantastic question, Susan. I don't know, I'm going to slightly do the trick of answering a slightly different question and hope, Susan, that satisfies you. So apologies if this doesn't satisfy you. But what's really interesting is the conscious brain is definitely a product of our sociality, right? So we live in social groups, and because as we started to live in social groups, we needed to evolve other mechanisms that helped us navigate those groups, right? So the conscious brain, language, these are all evolutionary products of us starting to group together, probably for security reasons. And that, as we discussed in the lecture, is driven by this sort of primary hormone, which is oxytocin, and there are a few other hormones. But what's really interesting about oxytocin and testosterone is they tend to act in inverse correlation. So as levels of as oxytocin go up, they tend to dampen the levels of testosterone in males. And anecdotally, we see this as well, right? Men, often when they're young men, can be very, very ambitious. And often when they get married, some of that ambition is perhaps put on the back burner or perhaps channeled into other activities like their families. And that the hormonal background to that, I would argue, is because once they're married in a loving relationship, start to have children, their levels of oxytocin, which is affectionately known as the cuddle hormone, they rise, and that lowers the level of testosterone in their systems. And there's quite a few scientific studies that trace that hormonal balance and that journey. So to come back to your, people rolling over and tickling bellies, I think that consciousness definitely evolved out of this sociability, and that both of those things have helped us drive down that kind of brute drive towards status. But great question, thank you.
Hope that answers your question, Susan. Please feel free to get back to us if you
Yes.
have any further comments. I'm very curious, you mentioned the Commentariat, which of course is very prominent when we discuss any of these matters. What kind of response and reactions did your book and your thesis receive in the various, the war studies people and the biologists and so on? Was it very controversial?
So in the war studies people, it's had a good reception, actually. They're predominantly, I have to say, amongst younger researchers or mid-career people, but that's had a good reception. And there are a few other scholars who are trying to look at this, so maybe biases in warfare, but they're trying to but they're trying to bring biology into war studies, because effectively war studies is, like many other political sciences, is studied with the implicit assumption of the rational actor model. And that, in economics, we've moved on from that right now. We now talk about behavioral economics, which tries to take into account our biases, and we recognize that Homo economicus is not really a thing when we're trying to model economic behavior. And that same argument is one that I'd advance in conflict studies, and I think that other people are trying to advance that as well. So that's gone really well. Amongst the commentariat or in public lectures like this one, often you get, I think people find it thought-provoking, but there is sometimes disbelief amongst people that war can be exhilarating and fun. I think, that's a bit of a taboo. It's a taboo to say that young men are driven to fight, and actually they find it quite pleasurable. I mean, that to a soldier who has experienced combat or been near it, that would not be a surprising thing. But we're so conditioned, and I think for very good reasons, we're very conditioned in society to see war as a bad thing, and one in which we can only talk about in negative terms. But I would argue that, as well as on an individual level, it's sort of exhilarating or pleasurable or even fun. Actually, on a macro level, war being this, and Margaret Macmillan advances this argument brilliantly, which war is, as such a powerful macro force within human society, has brought about all sorts of things that would not exist. And so we have, the stronger states that we enjoy now, which deliver us healthcare, higher levels of technology, peace and security, all those things, they're all a result of war. Stronger states came about because of war, because the states needed to improve their tax collection to fight the wars. And then afterwards, largely the populations demanded something back for their taxes. And so the Tilley's idea of the war makes the state and the state makes war is we see that right throughout history. So it is interesting that we have this taboo, that the commentariat reflect back at the population, but I would argue that war is not simplistic as such.
And that's the perfect response to present Mark's question, a very elemental question. Do you think the world would be a better place if we could cure the impulse to fight?
Undoubtedly. Undoubtedly it would be, although in order to cure it, you need to do a couple of things. Human history is these, you can reduce it to two things, right? An increase in average group size and a reduction in average violence. So today is, believe it or not, the safest time as an individual to be alive in terms of being murdered or killed in war. And, how does that continue? Well, it continues by moving up to a larger average group size, which is basically where we are, is the global the global commons or the global state. So, we are organized now in 193 countries, but actually the next level up is potentially regional groupings, but really a global state. And a lot of the problems that we face now as a species they sit between the national level and the global level. So climate change, sharing data, corporate and personal taxation, the collapse of the marine ecosystems, all these things sit between. And the reason they're not being solved is because they sit between the nation state and the global level, and global cooperation is kind of breaking down at the moment. So if you want to end war, what you need to do is build a global group. And the only way you do that is by painstakingly solving individual problems. Occasionally you come along and you have a sweeping agreement that does all sorts of things, like perhaps the foundation of the UN and the other organizations at the end of the Second World War. But really, international work is about painstaking agreements on difficult, intractable problems. And it's only through solving problems that eventually you avoid war, because war is effectively what you do when you can no longer solve the problem through talking. So that's the first thing we need to do. And the second thing is we need to do something about people who need to seek status and belonging. Again, coming back to this idea of the rational actor model, I think in the West, we imagine ourselves to be individuals, maybe connected up to, the digital universe and the physical universe and so on and so forth. But we are at heart fairly simple beings, and we do have these urges and drives towards belonging to groups and towards seeking status that we need to fulfill. And one of the reasons why you could argue that one of the reasons why European society, or perhaps Western quote unquote society is can be relatively peaceable, or has been relatively peaceable, is there's lots of outlets for people to seek status. You can pursue a career, sport. In a pluralistic society, there are lots of outlets for people to pursue status. And that is something that we need to think about as we move into the 21st century, into a world of AI and increasing technology and Neuralinks, where we're connected to computers all the time. We need to think about how we sate those very basic emotional drives towards status, belonging, and so on and so forth.
Based on your comments on testosterone, this isn't meant to sound like a glib question at all, but just as Amartya Sen says, democracies don't have famines. If there were more world leaders who were women, would there be less in the way of the conflict that you describe?
I'm a huge proponent of women in leadership for exactly that, primarily that reason, but also for other reasons as well. There's pretty robust data. If you look at peacemaking, if you include women in peace negotiations, so I'm talking about a civil war that's been going on in a country for 30 years, and if the parties come together and if there are women involved, the chance is 30% higher that peace agreement will last, and will last for longer. And why is that? Well, that it seems to me that the obvious reason for that is because women are more able to see beyond status problems. They're more able to back down. And of course, I'm talking about the average man and the average woman here, right? Of course, both men and women exist on a bell curve, and those bell curves overlap. So there will be women who seek status more than men. But on average, women seek status less than men. And that puts them and the data shows that enables them to make longer lasting and more durable peace agreements. And I would see it as exactly the same when it comes to political leadership.
The closest most of us have come to experiencing a war, I think, has curiously been in the last year, with the effect of the pandemic on the state and society, which is as profound in many ways as the Second World War was. And the link, as you were speaking, was the relatively strong performance of governments where women have been in charge over the course of the pandemic. Has the pandemic caused you, as you sit in your own quarantine in the Indian Ocean, has it caused you to think about what you've been studying in any greater detail? Have you had any reflections on the experience of COVID-19 as a global phenomenon?
Well, actually, in the book, I posited that there were 5 problems that societies or groups of humans need to solve. And, you know, those are, very briefly, hierarchy, who's in charge, identity, who's in the group, who's out the group, trade, how we either trade goods or share things, disease, and then punishment, how we punish infractions of the rules. And as I sort of thought about that, when I was writing the book in 2018, I thought, well, disease, yeah, that's a difficult. And so I feel somewhat vindicated that has become a huge problem for us to solve. To your point about female leaders and success, I mean, that's interesting because, you know, as you know, there have been these big arguments about, well, this type of government, you know, authoritarian or democratic or whatever, populist, this type of government has been more or less successful at coping with the pandemic. I think the jury's still out on that, although perhaps we can agree that populist leaders haven't done particularly well because they want to be popular, and you need to deliver bad news when you're managing a pandemic. I think what stands out to me very clearly, perhaps more so than women in leadership, although perhaps they're linked, what stands out very clearly is that countries where the population trusts the government tend to have better outcomes than countries where the population don't trust the government. And that's a very, very interesting finding, I find. And I think, you know, taking that forward, I think that's something that I think ambitious politicians of all stripes will be thinking very, very, very clearly about, to think about how they can enhance that public trust in the future.
Trevor has what I suspect is a misleadingly simple question. Why do some soldiers surrender? He also asked, as you're taking a swig, a secondary question: how do you explain a Christmas truce in the First World War?
So, I mean, the general point, right, is that evolution can only show us general trends, right? I can't say because evolution, therefore, in that specific instance, something happens, because every behavioral action is, of course, as I said, a mixture of genes, upbringing, learning, and, you know, the stimulus that you face in that particular instance, right? Again, a simplistic question. I think there's a simple answer. Why do you surrender? Because you actually, at that point in time, your group belonging, your idea of the group you belong to, gets supplanted by individual survival. And this is the wonder of group belonging. It's such a strong urge that people do, in individual instances, die or remain committed to the group up until the point that they are killed. And I think, you know, come back to this idea of the brain having lots of different modules, areas in it, doing different things, pulling in different directions. At that instance, one part of your brain just goes, hang on a minute, nope, and survival kicks in. And I think that explains surrender. And particularly, you know, surrender is a much more prominent phenomenon when prisoners are treated well and so on and so forth. And you know, sensible armies generally treat prisoners of the other side well, because it encourages other people, because they think, do you know what, I could sit this out and then go back to my family maybe afterwards. Where you had, for instance, in the Second World War, the Germans fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front, there was no quarter given, and prisoners were worked to death on starvation rations. So there's not much of a trade, you know, between surrendering or dying in combat, and so people tended to fight for longer and to the death. And that's again why perhaps the fight for Berlin took so long on the other foot, because the Germans thought, the shoe's on the other foot, we need to fight to the death, because otherwise, you know, what we did to them, they will do to us. The Christmas truce, I mean, I think I'll just slightly sidestep that by saying it's very hard to draw, you know, general lessons from evolution and apply them to a specific instance.
But Trevor's question prompts me to ask something that hasn't really occurred to me before. But when you're in training in Sandhurst and when you're deployed, and even before missions, is the notion of surrender or what to do in those circumstances ever raised?
No, never, because military training is about instilling group cohesion, really. at its nuts and bolts, military training, yeah, you learn some skills, how to use a rifle, how to do first aid, all that kind of stuff. Obviously, that's important. But at its heart, military training is about instilling group bonding with the people that you're going through training with. That is what human military training has been about for millennia, because cohesive teams, as we discussed in the lecture, 2 beats 1, 5 beats 2, 10 beats 5, cohesive teams, more than anything else, are what will ensure success in combat. So the idea that there is surrender, and one person can put up the white flag, and that immediately shatters team cohesion. No, I mean, I think the reality is, for the British Army, which until recently has been a sort of very successful army in military terms, surrender is something that the enemy do, and winning is something that we do, and that's part and parcel of instilling that esprit de corps within the troops that are being trained.
3 related but contrasting questions. First one is from Bert. How do you separate biology and culture? And what if a person neither seeks status or group belonging?
So how do I separate biology and culture? Well, again, I come back to this idea that every behavioral action or physical trait, right? Every physical or behavioral trait is a combination of genes and environment. And so it is impossible to separate them. It's less correct to say, what does this gene do? It's more correct to say, what does this gene do in that environment? And of course, environment is what a culture is. Our culture is our social environment. So the behaviors that I enact are reflections of my genes, the learning I've done up until that point, and then the environment or the culture that I'm sitting in at that time. So it's impossible to separate them. And just remind me again, Martin, what Bert's second question was? That was the first one.
What if a person neither seeks status or group belonging?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I come back to this idea of the bell curve. So all traits exist on this bell curve. So like height, most people are of a certain height, and then you have these outliers of very short or very tall people. That will be the same with, for example, seeking status or belonging. You will have individuals who are, in terms of status, who are very high. They seek a lot of status. Those people will tend to become leaders, or at least they will try very hard to become leaders. And there are those who seek belonging a huge amount, and perhaps they join political parties or choirs or whatever it is. And of course, conversely, there will be people who don't seek those things to a greater degree. I mean, everyone seeks them to a small degree, but we all know people who are gregarious and love being in groups, and we know people who are quieter and perhaps like to spend more time on their own, and they feel less comfortable in groups, or they don't feel as attracted to exist in groups. I mean, I would argue that everyone has both of those traits to a certain degree, but of course there will be people who really don't feel them and people who really do. And actually, I think there's an interesting question unresolved. What is the difference? If we've got this status and belonging, and we've got these bell curves, and people exist on different points, are the compositions of armies in terms of those traits different in volunteer armies versus conscripted armies? And I would argue that in a volunteer army, you're much more likely to get people who have higher levels of drives towards status and belonging than in a conscripted army, which is sort of by definition a slice through the population. That is as unyet tested, but I think it would be quite an interesting area for research.
Christopher has a double-header too. How does this tension between individual evolutionary pressures and group expansion and its reduction in violence get resolved? And his supplementary is, are you suggesting that we will see a gradual and inevitable end to war?
I'll take them together. I think actually, as we sit here now at the beginning of 2021, I would give it a 50-50 chance that before 2030, we're going to experience a fairly major global war. And that idea of increasing group size and decreasing violence over human macro history is not a straight line. It's like the teeth of a saw, if you can imagine it like that. When you zoom in, it goes up and down quite a lot. But over the long run, that's what the macro trend is. The question is, where are we now, right? We have a situation where we have a communications mechanism, the internet, which enables us, look, I'm in Australia, Martin, you're in Newcastle, the listeners are all over the place. We have a mechanism that enables us all to talk in real time. So we have a global communication mechanism. So that is really communications, like writing or the printing press, are the kind of the foundations for increases in group size. What they also do is they expose us to a greater degree of conscious thought of other human beings, right? So that unsettles us, because what we previously thought was our safe and secure group, suddenly we realize there's a whole world out there and it's not so quiet and safe and secure. And so what we need to do as a species is come up with a new set of global ideas that enable us to manage the planet in a way befitting of the levels of technology that we currently have, mostly communications technologies, but also other ones like AI and so on and so forth. Whether we are able to do that, because of course the communications technology increases discord and dissonance and makes it harder for us to do things, and this is a paradox of it, it increases the need to organize things on a global level, but actually makes it harder in some respects to gain political traction around these intractable issues. Whether we're able to do that before 2030, as I say, I think it's a bit of an open question. So I give it a 50-50 chance that we end up in a fairly major war before 2030.
As an aside, we're coming up in a month's time to the integrated review of the British government's attempt to bring together foreign policy, aid, defence, and so on. And there's already briefings about the army being cut and so on. Do you have any high hopes for this being seen in practice and a coherent strategy being presented?
No, in short. I mean, look, integrated review, this is I'm old enough to have seen this before, right? We've had the comprehensive approach and joint action and all the rest of it. They're going to get government departments to work together, are they? Oh, what a great idea. Why didn't we think of that before? It's nonsense. Look, they founded the MOD in 1964, I think, which the idea was to bring the three services together, to get them to work together. Well, that still hasn't happened because, funnily enough, humans are groupish and they fight for their groups. In the case of the MOD, the three services. In the case of the integrated review at Whitehall level, DFID doesn't exist anymore, but the development people, the diplomats and the defense people will fight their turf. The reality of, unfortunately, and I've worked in various bits of the British government, the reality of British government strategy is this. It is not, as Clausewitz and other, Lord Allenbrook teach us. Strategy is not setting out a vision and then working out whether we can achieve that vision and adjusting that vision dependent on resources. So, cutting our cloth to suit what we want to do with that cloth. Ways, ends and means is the kind of technical way of talking about strategy. That is not what the British government does. What it does is the three departments come up with what they want to do, and then they put that all in a document and go through lowest common denominating to work out what they can get in. And they all horse trade and scratch each other's back and say, well, if I support you on this, then will you support us on that? And so we end up with a mishmash that pleases people in Whitehall. They feel like they've got a good deal out of the review, but is almost entirely divorced from what the strategic needs of the country are. To argue that Britain, which is an important country, but a medium rate power in 2021, is able to project a global military presence is just complete nonsense. There are other aims that we could follow that are more within keeping of the resources that we're willing to divert towards our international posture. But I'm afraid it's a bit like Yesminster. And I paraphrase because I can't remember the exact quote, but the most important thing, if you're in the British government, is to make sure that the British public think that Britain is a strong international country that's well defended and has a strong military. Whether that's true or not is irrelevant.
That was a quite self-indulgent question on my part for my students. I'm very grateful. The last question we have, though, for this session is a much more interesting and profound one from Shima, who asks, if war is rooted in subconscious desire for status, then theoretically would an annual event where individuals and groups can fight and be designated winners and losers sort of satisfy these same urges adequately?
I think someone should make a movie about that. Yes, I think so. You know, whether wider society would accept blood sports, which is effectively what you're offering, is another question. But yes, I think it would. And in a sense, the people who would self-select for that, you know, rather than the kind of Hunger Games idea where people were selected for it, you want to make it a kind of gladiatorial contest like the Olympics, where people who feel that desire to test themselves on what you might call the ultimate plane can self-select and go for that. But yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. We've certainly had worse ideas in our history.
But they'd have to wear masks. It might detract from the... Mike Martin, thank you very much for your lecture this evening of Insights.
Thank you.
And we'll be back on Thursday at 5:30, our regular slot, with Grace Begley, who'll be speaking on the corona crisis, how the pandemic will change capitalism. Hope to see you then.